I am very mad at Richard, and it's kind of my fault. I always saw him as a very loving grandfather, but when I rewatched the show, I noticed so many flaws in his character that I just couldn't ignore anymore. And the funny thing is, I don't hate Richard. He has so many moments where I appreciate him and I think he's very wonderful. But this video is not about that. It's about all the times that Richard has disappointed me, and I think it's time to point them out. Number 1, Richard is distant, and we see this the most in the first season, and I think that's something that I forgot about when it comes to the first season. In the beginning, Richard has no desire to connect with Lorelai or to connect with Rory. It is always Emily that pushes him to do so. In the pilot episode, Richard asks Lorelai how her job at the motel is going, so he doesn't even know what job Lorelai has. And what's funny is that Emily sometimes serves as a foil to Richard. When Richard is at his worst, Emily seems to show almost a softer side. When Richard asks about the motel, notice what Emily says in response.
Lorelai's the executive manager now. Isn't that wonderful?
Speaking of which, Christopher called yesterday.
Richard then starts talking about Christopher, putting Christopher up on a pedestal, saying how smart Christopher is, and saying that Rory takes after Christopher. He has no regard for Lorelai's feelings. It's what sends Lorelai into the kitchen. Another example is Rory's birthday party. Emily goes way over the top in planning a birthday party for Rory, which is misguided on Emily's part. She shouldn't have done that. But during the birthday party, Emily's running around making sure that things are perfect, and Richard is spending his whole time at his granddaughter's birthday party talking about business. He's not interested whatsoever. Another example is the golfing episode. The first time that Richard and Rory bond is when they go golfing, and when I first saw this episode, I really started to like Richard because I thought it was so sweet how he is bonding with his granddaughter. But what I forgot about is the fact that Richard had no desire to go golfing with his granddaughter. Emily suggested it, and Richard gets very mad at Emily when she suggests that Rory come with him. He did not want to bond with her. Emily forced the interaction. She shouldn't have, but Richard had no interest whatsoever. And when he's about to go, he's telling Emily that he doesn't want to take Rory to lunch. He wants to do the very bare minimum. He wants to spend as little time as possible. This kind of tainted the episode for me a little bit. Number 2, Richard is elitist, and I think that that's an aspect that upsets me the most about his character. He's more focused on the appearance of propriety rather than being a good person. Status matters a lot to him, and some fans have pointed out that his love of Rory seems to be almost conditional. He only started to like Rory after he saw her potential. He sees her as a do-over, another Lorelai. When he saw that Rory was smart and she had the potential of going to an Ivy League school, that's when he really started to like her. Would he like Rory as much if she didn't fit his standard of perfection? So there are too many examples to point out about Richard's elitism, but I'm just going to focus on a few examples. The first one is when Dean comes over to Friday night dinner for the first time. Richard is being a total dick to Dean. He doesn't even shake Dean's hand, and Emily is actually being polite when Richard is being completely atrocious. What I find so fascinating about this scene is the speech that Richard gives to Dean. He says,
You know, when I was 10 years old, I knew exactly where I wanted to work. I knew I wanted to go to Yale and put on a nice suit every day and be a very important man in a very powerful firm.
This seems so incredibly shallow to me. When you break down what he actually says, he's not talking about a passion. He's not talking about something that he wanted to do when he was young. He doesn't mention the profession that he wants. He wants to be a man who puts on a nice suit every day. He wants to be an important man working in a very powerful firm. But it feels so empty when you look at it. He just wants to have power. He wants to have the status without having any motivation of doing something good for the world, or at least something interesting or creative or something that fulfills him. What he really wanted was just to have the money to travel and to see things, which is not an evil goal. There's nothing wrong with a person who wants to make a lot of money, but it just feels kind of a little absurd for a 10-year-old to desire that, and it really makes you wonder, is that what he really wanted at 10 years old, or was it the fact that he was raised that way by, well, his mother? To be clear, there is nothing wrong with a 10-year-old who wants to grow up and to have a lot of money. It just feels like there's something missing in that desire. There's usually at least another motivating factor. They have an idea of what they could potentially want to do, something that drives them. And when it comes to Richard, it almost feels like the only thing that he was fully motivated by was to follow in the steps of his family, to be someone who continues with the status, with the family name. Emily actually gets very mad at Richard for the way that he acted with Dean, and she forces Richard to apologize. So Richard only apologized after Emily told him to do so. And this is the first time that Rory sees how Richard really is. She gets so livid with Richard, and I love how Lorelai just stands there being like, well, yeah, you finally see what I mean. It's not just Emily. Richard is the same way. He will push you down, and you don't notice it with him as much, but there are times where it comes out, and it really hurts when he does this. I also want to contrast the way that Richard acted with Dean and the way that Richard acted with Tristan and Logan. The first time that he saw Tristan and the first time that he saw Logan, he saw that they came from fine families, so he was perfectly okay with Rory socializing with Tristan and socializing with Logan. Richard doesn't care what kind of people they are before he approves of them. They could be good people, but he has no idea. It doesn't matter to him. What matters to him is he knows their families, he knows they come from good families, and that's all that matters. He is a complete monster to Dean just based on status, and he is very nice to Tristan and very nice to Logan just based on status. So another example is when Richard is an advisor to one of Rory's projects for economics, and he didn't even want to participate. He didn't want to help Rory out. It was Emily who convinced him to work with Rory. After he agrees, he gets super into it, but then we see the most sore loser moment I've ever seen. Richard gets so furious when they don't win the competition. He gets so mad that he yells at Headmister Charleston, a longtime friend, for the fact that he didn't win. And obviously, Richard is going through a lot in that moment. He was forced into retirement, he's going through his own issues, but it still doesn't justify his level of anger at the competition. It feels like he sees himself as so important that he doesn't understand why he wouldn't win.
I demand a recount. Very well. I just recounted. The alarm still wins.
Another good example of Richard's elitism is when Christopher's parents, Strobe and Francine, come over to the Gilmore house. Strobe starts attacking Lorelai, saying that Christopher failed in life because of Lorelai. It is Lorelai's fault that Christopher didn't go to Princeton. Richard gets insanely angry with Strobe, as he should. He then yells at Strobe and he kicks Strobe and Francine out, which is a very heartwarming moment, seeing that Richard is standing up for his daughter. But then, Lorelai walks into Richard's office to thank him for standing up for her, and he says,
Why do you think I did it?
He explains it as,
A member of my family was being attacked. The very Gilmore name was being attacked. I will not stand for that.
So he was not defending Lorelai to defend his own daughter. He was defending Lorelai because the Gilmore name was being attacked, and so by extension, he was being attacked. He then says, I had to tell my friends, my colleagues, that my only daughter was pregnant and was leaving school. So what upsets him is the fact that the appearance of his family was tainted. And it's just so heartbreaking to see that in that moment where Lorelai feels grateful and she feels like her father is looking out for her, but then he just pushes her down like that. He minimizes her again. He makes her feel like she's not the one that's important. The family name is what's important to him. The scene with Richard and Lorelai reminds me of a scene from Buffy, and Buffy spoilers here, so please skip ahead if you have not seen the show. But I would be remiss if I don't mention it, because there's such a parallel between these scenes. Buffy is confronted by her friends because she was hiding a secret. Her father figure steps in when everyone's attacking Buffy, and he says, enough is enough, everyone go about your business. Buffy then walks into Giles' office to thank him for standing up for her. And this is where Giles gets really mad at her. He says,
You've jeopardized the lives of all that you hold dear by harboring a known murderer.
Both scenes are very powerful, and they're both structured the very same way. In both scenarios, the father figure steps in to defend the protagonist, and then, in private, they get mad at the protagonist. However, the justification that they provide for their anger demonstrates why they did it in private. Richard did it in private because his family and his image was being attacked. He would not do it publicly because that would taint his image. Number 3. Richard does not defend his wife against his mother. Now, when it comes to Trix, that woman is a piece of work, and I'll get to her eventually, but it's not about her today, it's about Richard. And Trix attacks Emily so overtly and so blatantly that anyone standing on the sidelines would see it. You could see it from miles away. Emily experiences extreme anxiety every time Trix comes over. She's extremely fearful, and she gets very upset and nervous. Richard just stands on the sideline and just allows it. Now, I've seen people argue that Richard is just so oblivious that he has no idea that Trix is being serious. He thinks that Trix is joking. And for me, it almost feels absurd because the way that Emily reacts, I think any reasonable person would understand that this is not a joke. The things that Trix says are just plain cruel. they could not be perceived as funny. She's just overtly mean to Emily. She's actually overtly mean to other people, but when it comes to your own wife, you would think there'd be at least some sort of a defense or at least some sort of an attempt to fix the relationship. What's so upsetting is that Richard often stands there and he's laughing along. So not only is he not defending his wife, but he seems to be amused by the situation. The one time that he sees Trix and Emily start to get close and have a conversation, he actually gets nervous. And that's almost kind of upsetting. He gets nervous about the fact that they would actually resolve their problems when they start talking to each other. For some reason, he doesn't like the idea of them being friends. So he's perfectly okay with the fact that Trix attacks Emily, but when they actually start to develop a relationship, that bothers him. And I know that Richard doesn't hate his wife. I think it's shown many times that he loves Emily, but in those moments, I just wonder, it looks like he hates her. Why would he want his wife to be attacked this way? On this point, there are also several times when Richard minimizes Emily's contribution and he sees her activities as trivial. He defends Emily in front of others, but he feels entitled to minimize her value himself. So when it comes to others, he'll protect Emily, except for his mother, but he doesn't seem like he values her. Some fans have pointed out an interesting example. When Rory joins the DAR, he has this moment of fear because he's afraid that Rory is going to end up like Emily. This almost suggests that he doesn't see what Emily does as valuable. So I know it seems like I've been defending Emily a lot, and I just want to say that Emily does a lot of wrong. Emily can be extremely manipulative. She has her own selfish and self-driven reasons for the things that she does. What I find so interesting is that Emily sometimes serves as a contrast to Richard, that when Richard is being very heinous, Emily's anger is used to highlight the fact that what Richard is doing is wrong. Number 4, Richard tricks Rory into a meeting with Yale's Dean of Admissions. He doesn't tell Lorelai, he doesn't tell Rory, and he doesn't tell Emily. When Rory walks out of that meeting, she looks like she just walked out of battle, and she is insanely upset. And it makes so much sense why she would be upset. That is an incredibly stressful thing to put on a child. This is an 18-year-old who is deciding on colleges, and this is a very big Ivy League school. She's not dressed for it, she's not prepared for it, she was not anticipating it. It is incredibly cruel to put that level of pressure on a person who likes to be prepared and who actually would want to get in and who would want to make a good impression. Richard had no regard for Rory's feelings or the impact that it would have on her. His decision was completely self-motivated. Now, Richard's points about why Rory should apply to Yale are valid. It makes so much sense that because he's an alumni, it would be easier for Rory to get in, and it is a good backup for her to get into Yale. However, the methods that he uses are terrible. What he does is incredibly manipulative, and it really hurts Rory in the process. There was no reason to put this much pressure on her at the time when she's incredibly stressed. Number 5, Pennylin Lott. Richard has been meeting with his ex once a year for the whole time that he's been married to Emily. So he has been going behind Emily's back, keeping it a secret. Now, there's nothing wrong with a person meeting up with their ex for lunch once a year. That is perfectly acceptable as long as all the parties are okay. But keeping it a secret is horribly wrong. And there's a good reason why he kept it a secret. He knew how wrong it was. He knew how upset Emily would get. It's just so unbelievable that he's been doing it for over 3 decades. And it really makes you wonder, for the whole 30 years that he has been doing it, 35 years, however long it's been, there's not been a single time when Emily asked him where he's going. He must have deceived her at some point, or at one point sort of hid what he was doing. So he has been completely silent on it, and in this case, this omission is a lie. Emily's anger is very justified in that moment. She does take it out on Lorelai, which is horrible. She should not have done that, and it feels like that runs in the family. Richard takes out his anger on other people. Emily takes her anger out on other people, so she was right to be upset, but she should not have been mad at Lorelai for it. Number 6, Richard screws over Jason. So we all know what happens. Richard comes back to Floyd and he takes all of Jason's clients. Jason is left with nothing. When Floyd threatens a lawsuit, Richard looks Jason in the eye and he says, "You have my trust." So Richard's trust and Richard's word means nothing. He is so comfortable in screwing over a person's life. What Richard does to Jason, I think, is just... It's horrible. I don't think I have any words to say it, but he is just a pure monster in that moment. And what highlights this is that Emily gets so angry with Richard for that she actually separates from him. Now, granted, the reason why Emily decides to separate is not because she recognizes that what Richard does is wrong. She does it because she's afraid of losing Lorelai. In addition, Richard puts up his pension as collateral for a loan so he could start his business. He doesn't tell anybody. Notably, he doesn't tell his own wife. Emily is his partner. Emily is his dependent. He put his own livelihood at risk and her livelihood at risk by putting up the pension. He knew that the business was a risk. This is such a big life decision that you have to share it with your spouse. So he dug his own hole. He was well aware of the fact that it was a risk. He took it on by himself. He didn't tell anybody. He dug a hole and then he had to screw over another man in order to fix it. Number 7. Richard threw a man out of a window. Okay, so this one, I don't think I even remember when I first watched the show, and oh my god, I don't know. For some reason, in some weird ways, this is somehow the worst of it. Maybe I'm wrong, but here's what happened. Richard is visiting Rory at Yale. He's talking to Rory in Paris, and he's reminiscing about his old days at Yale. He says that when he was a sophomore, he had a roommate that he didn't like. And because he didn't like this roommate, he tied his roommate between 2 mattresses and he threw him out of a window. He then did this every single night until the roommate transferred. So the roommate didn't just move rooms, the roommate actually left Yale. Now, when Rory asks, was he okay? Richard says he was fine, he slept it off, he got up and went about his day. But who is this story coming from? It's coming from Richard. Of course, Richard would minimize it. This is Richard's perspective. So he is sitting there talking to 2 impressionable 18-year-olds, reminiscing about the good old days at Yale and saying how he bullied a kid to transfer out of Yale.
Well, do you think you guys tossing him out the window on a regular basis might have had something to do with that decision?
Yes, however, we were young and full of energy. Every day was an adventure.
He has no regrets whatsoever that he bullied someone to transfer out of school. This is a man in his 60s who's laughing about the fact that he threw a guy out of a window multiple times.
What is that all about?
That is about 100 years worth of inbreeding.
Okay, so I don't like to end on a bad note, and as I've said before, I still don't hate Richard. I'm very upset and disappointed in Richard, but I don't hate him. And the reason for that is because I do see that he's a product of his environment. There are reasons why he turned out the way that he did, and he does have those moments which I really appreciate. It feels like inside, he's not a bad person, but he's just been raised in an environment where, since birth, he was taught that status is everything. I put my blame on Trix. I think probably people would have guessed, but Trix upsets me a lot, and I will get to Trix. But I think that Trix really fucked up Richard, and it's cruel, and it does not justify Richard's actions. I do not want to justify everything that Richard has done. I am still very mad at Richard for all the behavior that he has shown, but at least I understand him a little bit. If there was ever a time that Richard has disappointed you or made you mad, let me know. I would love to hear about it. This was obviously only a very subjective opinion on Richard. And I do want to talk about all the times that Richard has shown himself to be a good person or a very caring person, but I don't think I want to do that in this video. I think it'll be a separate one. It'll probably be much shorter because I can't do long videos, not yet anyway, but I just want to end with saying thank you for watching. I would love to hear what you think about Richard. I would love to hear what you think about other characters, and I'll try to incorporate them into other videos about these characters. So thank you so much. Again, I appreciate you.